I spoke to some clients today about adoption support. They told me that if they had the support that they needed 5 or 6 years ago, they wouldn't be in the difficult situation they now found themselves in and about which they were seeking my advice. Adoption support is one of those troubling areas for many adoptive families. When my wife and I adopted, we were never told about any adoption support. The only support we actually got was to be placed into a group of people who had also adopted at the same time as us. This was 30 years ago, so you would hope that in many ways things had changed. But sadly for many adopters, they find themselves in the same situation that we did, not knowing where to turn when things got difficult. I have to say that the group of people who we were with were a good group. They were very supportive, but frankly, none of us at that early stage were prepared to be very honest about the challenges we were already facing. After a child is placed with adopters with a view to having an application made at some point in the future, the question of adoption support really begins to bite. Many adopters don't actually know a great deal about the child who has come to live with them. Sometimes, and I stress the word sometimes, there is a conspiracy almost of silence between the social worker who's under pressure to place the child, the foster carer who might have been looking after the child or children, and you only need that combined with adopters who are so determined to go ahead that they don't spot the obvious. Very often children come into a family with a view to adoption, and all that's really known is from the adoption medical which has taken place. Many adopters would certainly benefit from having information from the care proceedings, and actually within those proceedings having the benefit of the psychological or whatever assessments, paediatric assessments that might have been carried out on that child. If a child is part of a sibling group, it's critical that they should certainly ask about whether there has been any assessment carried out of the sibling relationships. Sometimes there is that situation arises whereby children who've not been together in the same foster placement, brothers and sisters, are suddenly placed together at the adopter's home, and adopters discover that the relationship between them is toxic. Although there's a move to try and keep children together as siblings, sadly, because of the upbringing they've had, the relationship often between children who are siblings is not as good as it might be. So the first person who adopters really need to pin down is the social worker who's placing the child and getting them to be absolutely honest about what's happened that's led them, the children, to go into care, what their experience was, how did the foster carers cope, did the foster carers raise any specific concerns, did the foster carers find that having two siblings together was problematic. These are critical questions that need to be resolved. There is always, when an adoption is applied for, a requirement that there should be an assessment for adoption support, but quite often adoption support plans are fairly useless. They're full of empty words and wishes that somehow adopters can look to the statutory services for support should they need it. The rules are very clear. For financial support, if the placing local authority or adoption agency is going to pay an adoption allowance, then they are responsible for paying that allowance right through. It is, of course, a means-tested allowance, and it's also subject to annual review. Now, I've come across situations whereby local authorities will say, well, we'll pay an allowance for, say, 4 years or 5 years, and then it's going to stop. Again, I've had the experience of having to advise adopters who took that in good faith and then discovered that the child whom they have taken responsibility for is so demanding or has such a diagnosis that they weren't aware of, that they, for example, have had to give up work.